Well, earlier I spoke to someone who has long been advocating for ways to keep Africa's best and brightest professionals from leaving for opportunities abroad. She's a scientist and academic and the former president of Mauritius, Amina Gurib-Fakim. She says investment in STEM is key to reversing Africa's brain drain. Dr. Amina Gurib-Fakim, thank you so much for your time. I really appreciate it. Thank you for joining me here. Ma'am, the African Union estimates that about 70,000 skilled professionals emigrate from the African continent every year. You've been talking about this for years, ways to keep Africa's skilled professionals at home. If we look at the people leaving African countries today, and in terms of the kind of skilled professionals, who is leaving? And according to what you know, why are they leaving?
Well, first of all, thank you for having me, Heidi. It's always a pleasure to speak to Voice of America. You know, migration has always been, since mankind has existed, people have moved around. And I myself, I've migrated from my country to get an education overseas, at least a tertiary education, but I came back home. And unfortunately, this is the core that many people are adopting now. When they're moving for good. And it's a loss for the continent, there's no doubt, especially at a time when the continent needs all its resources, human capital and otherwise, for its movement. Having said this, we cannot prevent people from moving, from migrating, but what we can try and do is create the ecosystem that will help retain the talent in-house on the continent for our own gain. And I think I've just mentioned one word, the ecosystem, which we need to build. And I think gradually Africa is rising up to this challenge, and there are pockets of such ecosystem which are being created on the continent, which will hopefully retain some of the talent. But unfortunately, it is a feature which is happening across the world. They're moving to America. If you look at, for example, the Silicon Valley, you find that over 40% of the talents, they come from India. So this is a challenge that most countries face. And if you look, fortunately rather, to a country like China, I mean, they have done very well by retaining and also bringing back its talent. So maybe there are lessons to be drawn there as how China has done it. But I wouldn't be far off to say that it's because they have invested in that space.
Migration is, of course, normal. And as you mentioned, countries like India, many other countries have this problem. The United States itself, has a brain drain too. But how much of this trend of Africa's young professionals leaving is normal and how much of it isn't?
Well, we just have to look at some sectors. I mean, if you look at, for example, a country like Nigeria, Nigerians in the United States, they represent, I think, 1% of the entire diaspora of African Americans. And if you look at, for example, the intake at an institution like Harvard, for example, they represent 25%, I think, of the intake there in terms of the African Americans who are actually finding admission in a prestigious institution like Harvard. So, it's where I think many countries are failing because they haven't invested in the higher education system. And I think this is, again, where Africa has to run before it can actually walk, because we need to play catch-up very fast, especially now we're talking increasingly about the fourth industrial revolution, where the investment, again, needs to be done. And hopefully, and I sincerely hope that leaders are waking up to the fact that they need to put their hands in their own pocket to invest in the people, because by 2050, there will be about 1 billion young people who will be available for the world of work, and they would come from the African continent.
And to that point, Dr. Gurib-Fakim, a recent article by Time magazine referred to what's happening as a global war for young talent. Africa, of course, as you just mentioned, has the world's youngest population. Do you agree that there is a global war for young talent? And how equipped is Africa as a region really to combat this trend?
I think we'll have to posit this global war for talent, especially now as the countries are waking up after the COVID. And there has been recently making the headlines, the Great Resignation. So I think people, major pandemics have always shaped the world of work. And right now, as we speak, because now we have the digital space to actually flag into the equation, I think we find that the war will be on for talents because they will be able to operate from elsewhere than the office space that they used to in the past. So this is a new paradigm that African countries have to actually cope with. And again, Africa, it will be sectoral because if you look at countries like Northern Africa, they have understood. If you look at South Africa, they are understanding. If you look at countries like Rwanda, even my country, we're trying to invest in the digital space. So I think eventually the war, as you have mentioned, will be in the space, not just in the physical space of getting the talent to the laboratory, but also getting the talent even online. Who are those who are more tech savvy and who can actually respond to the needs of the continent? So again, it's all about Africa investing in her own people, and that is going to be the challenge.
And of course, speaking about the pandemic, we also saw during COVID-19 that, or at least at the height of COVID-19, that there is this global demand for Africa's medical professionals, Africa's doctors, nurses, etc. And, earlier in the show, we were talking about how the outgoing Africa CDC director, Dr. John Kengasong, proposed an initiative to entice Africa's medical professionals to come back to the continent. Dr. Gurib-Fakim, is it fair to expect people or to hope that people will come back and leave behind lucrative, successful careers that they have built and sacrificed for in other countries? Is it fair to expect them to come back?
I think I will answer the question slightly differently. I don't expect the people who have, as you have rightly said, a lucrative career, everything to go for them, for their families, for their children, let's say in Europe or in America, to come back to Africa. But what I'm proposing, I think increasingly is being accepted, is to have this brain circulation. That means we engage with the diaspora more and more through projects. I mean, we don't expect them to come back, but I think what we would like to see, as I say again, is a wish, and I hope they actually take up this desiderata from leaders in Africa, is to spend some time on the continent, and also to try and be that role model, and also to actually help those young people who are aspiring to become, scientists, engineers, and give them a little bit of the time. So be that role model, and also try and take them by the hand so that they rise, and hopefully, like a country like Ghana, for example, they are attracting some of the talents back home. But again, it will all depend on the level of investment, and also what are the incentives that the mother country is putting forward. Because I'm sure a lot of the talented Africans would love to go back, but provided they find something to do. So let us capitalize first and foremost on what I increasingly refer to as brain circulation.
Now, Madam, of course, as the former president of Mauritius, and in your capacity now, you travel a lot, you meet a lot of policymakers, government leaders. What is your sense about the approach that the African continent is taking here in order to attract professionals back? Is it a case of, if we build it, they will come, or should they come first so we can build it?
I think there is this awakening. I again posit this within the framework, the post-colonial history of the continent, which is on average 60 years. So it's taken some time, there's no doubt. As I said, we have to run before we can actually walk. But I think there is this awakening that Africa has to cater for its own youth. And and in fact, if you look at the age gap between the leaders and the young people, we are talking about an age gap of over 50 or 60 years in some region. So we need to address this. We also need to see that Africa is the youngest continent. So there is the gradual awakening. But again, it is an issue that takes time. I mean, look at, for example, in some of the prestigious institutions we have in many countries in the West. I mean, it's taken years to actually grow. But having said this, there are some flagship institutions in South Africa, for example, and these universities, they appear within the first 400 among the best in the world. So we have to actually keep on investing in that space, invest in our people, invest in our ecosystem, and so invest in the young people, because no one will do that for us. And this is the message I've been taking to leaders across the continent, is that we need to invest in our own people. It's our responsibility first and foremost. So this is the only time that when you create that space, be it as entrepreneur, be it as incubators, provide them with venture capital, provide them with the angel funding. This is the time when they will translate their finding, their interests, their inventions into becoming that entrepreneur, so that they can actually create jobs for more and more young Africans.
Seeing Africans doing well in other countries, and of course they're contributing to economies everywhere in the world. But seeing them do well is, of course, also a source of pride for the continent. So one feels a little torn. At the same time, you want to see your people on a global stage contributing sort of at that level. But at the same time, of course, we want to retain the best on the continent. As war broke out in Ukraine and we started seeing the number of African students, of course, trying to get out, but it did make one think about, wow, how many African students were studying in a country that one might not even think about? And then you start thinking how many more students are now all across the world. Did seeing those images, elicit in you some concern that these are more people who might not return, whose education abroad might be a gateway to careers abroad?
Yes, I think many young Africans were tempted, and I think they have studied in Ukraine. I think it provided quality education that met with their aspirations. And what we saw, in fact, this evening, we saw many Cameroonian students who are still stuck there, and they are sending pictures and, of course, videos from wherever they're staying through their mobile phone. So it's a crisis, and some Africans have managed to come up. But then again, if you look at a big country like India with about over 20,000 students there, again, getting them out of the country has come in a very, very small trickle. But unfortunately, we have also seen the crisis as some Africans who actually were fleeing through Poland, what they come up with. I mean, there has been some horrifying stories of, you call it racism, you call it bias, whatever it is. So there is this they have to grapple with. But I agree that the message should have been listened to. I think the various countries might have issued a call for them to move out as soon as they heard that there were going to be, of course, rumblings of war. But we are where we are, unfortunately, and I hope that they come out, at least wherever they are, they stay safe. And if they can come out, I mean, I'm sure the embassies and the consulates will try and help them to the best of their abilities.
Ma'am, you co-authored an article for Brookings Institution in which you said that STEM is the key, and investment in STEM is the key to Africa's economic transformation. Please tell us what you mean by that, and why STEM? Because let me just tell you, there are others who might not be good at science, technology, engineering, and mathematics. I am one of those people. But what kind of opportunities are also worth investing in for people who might not be inclined to go into those areas?
I would add also one more letter to the STEM. So science, technology, engineering, arts, and mathematics. And then I would add another layer, we girls in STEM, girl in STEAM. Why I put the A? Because we are seeing increasingly, especially in the world of design, IT, where you need that artistic mind. Now, why do we need women in STEM? I'll just take one sector. I'll just take the sector of agriculture. This is the sector that is feeding the continent. We saw the problem of food security over the past 2 years during the COVID era. And I think if we look at agriculture, it's a $1 trillion business that Africans are sitting on. And Africa is a continent which actually is home to 60% of the world arable land. And why I mention agriculture, because it's something that people can understand very quickly, is that often the stereotype image that we have of agriculture on the continent is that woman with a hoe digging a very dry soil with a baby on her back in the hot sun. This is not agriculture. This is not how it's done in Africa. Granted that Africa's agriculture is 85% dependent on rainfall, being a rain-fed agriculture. So there are challenges. But I think if we bring in the technology, if we bring in the women who are empowered with the tools of technology, and for that to happen, she must have the modicum of training in the sciences at a very young age. So then she can become that entrepreneur, she can access capital, she can invest in the land and provide food. And also, we mustn't forget that the African continent has now the Africa Free Trade Agreement, which actually is operational since 2021. So that means that there is an internal market. So meeting the quality standards, quantity is there, and we should see through only one sector, agriculture, more integration, so we can move beyond the paltry 18% of trade across the continent. If only for that sector we can increase by 40%. Now just think of the innovation that can bring. When we transform the raw material, and transformation of the raw material means innovation. So there is an entire supply chain that can be addressed, because who talks about agriculture talks about medicine, through these medicinal plants that we grow. Through this, we talk about cosmetic product, raw material, which actually go into cosmetics, shea butter, baobab oil, all these. So there is an entire supply chain that can be addressed to create not just jobs, but also create food security and also create, an entire enterprise for these young people who are thinking about going in this field. But when we put in the technology, we take away the negative stereotype that agriculture has so far, and hopefully bring in the young people. And when we say bring in the young people, we of course go back to what we had said earlier on in terms of reducing emigration and migration.
Ma'am, may I just ask you to expand a little bit on something you mentioned earlier? You mentioned that China seemed to have had some success in attracting its talent back to the country. What are some of the lessons that you think that the African continent can learn from that experience, or African countries can learn from that experience, that could be sort of immediately implemented, or at least just at the start? And also, are there African countries that, in your estimation, are actually doing a good job of at least trying to attract their talent?
The Chinese story is unique in as much as it started opening up to the world in 1978, of course, with the vision of Deng Xiaoping. And if you look at that country, which was, of course, very poor in 1978 when the country started opening up, to now, it came out from the cold, and now, if you look at among the first 25 universities, you find 2 Chinese universities there. So there has been, important decisions which have been taken. And if you juxtapose this, the Chinese example, to the South Korean one as well. And if you go back 50 years, when Ghana was becoming independent, for example, about the same time, South Korea was also, they had more or less the same GDP. And of course, we know now where South Korea is, and we see now Ghana is now moving up slightly. But, there is a chasm in terms of salary, in terms of, it's a giant. And they have been able to do this by investing, because why I mention South Korea is that South Korea doesn't have any resources, no minerals, only the human capital. So they have been able to grow because they have invested in their people, they have invested in their ecosystem, innovation, and they have prioritized science over everything else. And we now see that this country is a giant. And also, as we speak, I think South Korea, the government, invest in the space, and I think they invest about 7 to 8% of their GDP, which is also matched by the private sector. And unfortunately, in Africa, we're still struggling to actually invest that 1%, which the African Union asked for. So again, we know what the answer is. We know what the solutions are. So we have to get our act together and pull our resources together and make it happen. There are interesting centers where they are attracting some of the talent. Again, I go back to South Africa. And I also find, for example, a country like Rwanda, which is doing quite well. And why I mention Rwanda? Because it's a country that has been like the phoenix. It's risen after the genocide 1994, and it's doing quite well in terms of the indicators. Senegal is also doing quite well because Senegal had been chosen by the center, the CDC, and the WHO to be one of the countries to be producing vaccines very soon. So there are pockets. Of course, Africa is 55 countries. It is not one country like India or China. So there are many layers to the development. And one thing I always say that Africa is a very rich continent. All the resources. Africa is a continent that has actually underwritten, if I may use the word, the first, second, the third, and now the fourth industrial revolution through the minerals that they have, the rare earth, and you name it, it's there. So we should be able to actually pull these together and make it work for us too.
I have a bit of a request from you, ma'am. A lot of these messages that, you're speaking not just to people on the continent, but also people outside of the continent, and this idea of trying to get them back. And a lot of those messages are about, yes, speaking to the head, but also speaking to the heart. If I were to ask you to be the continental spokesperson in this interview and try and speak to people working abroad, professionals, what would your message be to them if you could speak to them directly about the benefits for them of coming back to the continent?
I will speak to these very talented Africans who are, be it in the United States, be it anywhere in the developed world where they're making big contribution. Provide us a little bit of your time. Come and be that role model. Come and actually help that young girl, that young boy, make that child dream. Because if that child dreams big, and again, I quote here President Sirleaf Johnson when she said that you have to dream big and your dreams have to scare you. So these people who are out there, help that child dream big. Make sure that the dream for that children there scare them, because then they will rise to the challenge. And if they are there as a mentor, and if they are there as a role model, I think anything is possible. And I think sometimes it's all that it takes is to have that mentor there, to have that support. So please, let's try and encourage brain circulation and help those and take them by the hand on the continent.
Well, Dr. Amina Gurib-Fakim, that certainly had an effect on this African living abroad. I'm not quite ready to take the first flight back to Cape Town, but I will tell you that's an incredibly effective message, because as anyone who has come from the continent, when you hear that, that does have an effect, doesn't it? Ma'am, thank you so much for your time, and we really appreciate your perspectives and your insights.
Thank you so much for having me. Have a great day.
Thank you.
Care.
And that was my conversation with the former president of Mauritius, Amina Gurib-Fakim.